Hey, welcome back to Connection Point Studies. We're glad you're along with us for this series called Unfaithful. And during these series, the sermons oftentimes will be a little different than the Bible studies. That's purposeful. Don't be afraid to bring information in from the sermons, but also use this time to dig differently. That's really why we do this, right? It's a little different, and yet it's the same, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know even our own small group will often say, "Well, wait, we didn't go. Everybody didn't make it to service this week, and you don't need to go to service to follow this
Yes,
along.
you do. You got to go to service.
You always need to be at church. But if you miss, it can't be that you can't do that week.
Right. Okay, so Alex, this first question always is the one that we want everyone to answer. So let's give them that
Yep. This
question.
is our warm-up question, kind of break the ice with everybody. So, if you could choose a different name for yourself, what would it be?
Okay, we both kind of talked about this, and I have a feeling people in the group are going to say, I like my name. Why would I choose a different name? So hopefully you had to answer it anyway. So if you had to answer that question, what would it be?
Well, I mean, that is a tough question. As we talked about, you kind of grow into your name, right? If for those of us that have children, and you name your child, and they kind of grow into it. Myself, so I go by my middle name. My full name is Timothy Alexander, and I've always gone by my middle name. My son's the same way. His full name's Timothy Dillon. He goes by Dylan. And so I've always kind of gone by two names because in school, I'd often be called Tim. And then, so it's always a little different. And, would I go back to maybe just my first name? I don't know. I like being different. So what about you? Would you change your name?
You know what the problem is? I can't even begin to think of another name. That's the hard part for me, is that I can't even think of another name. Other than my last name, I could go along with Snap, Crackle, and Pop or something like that with Kellogg, So we'll have to see.
There you go.
Whatever the case, hopefully you had a chance to share a little bit. Now, what we want to do is we want you to dig into the scripture a bit. And so we've asked you to look at Hosea chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. And we want you to read that. And then before you come back, answer the question that we have for you.
Right, so read Hosea chapter 1, verse 3 through 11, and focus in, after you read it, back on verse 4. And what is the significance of the child's name?
This is an interesting passage of scripture. In fact, it's almost troubling, isn't it? Each name has a really negative connotation, doesn't it? And so when I look at this, you're unloved, or not my people. I mean, these are tough names. It's obvious that God was sending a message to the people of Israel that, hey, this is not good. Now, there's something more about this too.
Well, and as you go in, and depending on the Bible you have, you might have a Bible that actually kind of will allow you to see the other references of the scripture. And, it goes back into actually of 2 Kings First Kings, chapter 21. And when Jason and I were going through this, it was just interesting of how it all correlates back in.
That's together. The Jezreel.
Jezreel, yeah. Right. And so it's just kind of interesting of how that, and just of how God does remember, right? And he's displeased.
Yeah. He is sending a message through these names, which is very, very interesting. He's sending a message. And, in a way, we send a message to our kids by how we name them. We think about their names, all of that. And God thought about these names. There's also a significance in that the father was probably not Hosea, because she was unfaithful. And so there's a significance of that as well. Now, let's go on to the next question.
Okay, the next question is, we want you to focus in and reread verses 6 and 9. And with this, why are the other two children of Gomer named awful things?
We kind of talked about this already. Clearly God's sending a message. He's saying to these people, you're not my people anymore. Really, not by his choice. It's really by their choice. And, to me, I think this points to the fact that God always leaves free will out there for mankind, and that we always have a choice of whether or not we will love God, want to love God, live for God. And we see that with our kids too, don't we?
We do. And I think too with this is that the scripture does, and we have the benefit of reading it after it's happened, and seeing. Hindsight is amazing, isn't it? But it really does foretell and tell of what is about to happen with Israel and the coming exile, and the significance of that, especially when you can go back and you can look at the references of the scripture of where it points back to, and it begins to make more sense. So I want to encourage people to take the time and look at that. Hit pause, and even though we're not going to go into that, doesn't mean that you can't go in and learn more about that and read that if you haven't read that part of scripture before.
Right. Okay, let's go to question 3.
Okay, so for question 3, we want you to now focus in on verses 10 and 11. And how can there be redemption for people? So again, how can there be redemption for people? Verses 10 and 11.
So, Alex, I want to pick up a little bit where we just talked about these names. When God said, "These are not my people," the thing that was so significant about the people of Israel is they were known as the people of God. So when he declares to these kids, "They're not my people," he really says there's this period of time where I'm kind of disowning these people. But redemption is all about buying them back, which is such a great, powerful picture, isn't it?
Well, it really is. And again, especially as we talked about, but I mean, knowing the end of what happens, it really begins to make more sense. But of how, I can only imagine just of how, and we kind of talked about this last week, but of how confusing it must be when you go through these hard times of understanding things, and the benefit we have to use this scripture to help guide us.
Yeah. And
yet often, again, this is not a book that is often read.
Yeah.
It's often a book that is, man, I mean, there's what good's coming out of this, but yet there's a really good stuff you can pull out of it.
Well, I also think this is a good time for us to think about our own kids. As we see our kids and we see them make mistakes and all that, I mean, we just would do anything to win them back. And that's the same here with God. Let's go on to the next question we have for him.
Okay, so this is our last question here. So who is Hosea supposed to be imitating in this story, and why is this important?
Of course, Hosea is imitating God the Father. He's imitating the fact that he's had kids that seem to be illegitimate kids born out of a worship of another god, and they've become something he never intended them to be. And there may be people in our group that have kids that are turning out maybe different than they always dreamed they would be, or maybe you have a brother or a sister, or maybe even yourself. Your parents had a different view. This is a picture of God the Father and what he really thought it would be like, and how different it is.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Israel, of being God's children, and just of how, if you follow along with what they have done, with as you've talked about, and we were talking offline there, but just of that, I mean, the sacrifices that they were doing with these other gods, and really the detestable acts that were happening, and how Gomer is Israel, with the children being the offspring that have coming out from generation to generation, and it's impactful when you get into that and you truly understand it. Because again, just reading it, sometimes I am one, maybe it's just me, but I often will glaze right over that until I actually can find a way to pull those verses apart, and this is a great way to do it.
Awesome. So we want to take what you've already done here today, and then let's think of a way to apply this. And we always have this question for you, which is designed for everybody in the group to share. So let's give them that question.
And with this question, please don't just, I'm in a group. I know that sometimes we quickly, and I'm sure my group, I'm going to get the eye with this when we go up this, but take some time and answer this. And I think my group does a good job, but how can you better follow God?
Each one of you answer that question, and then we'll see you next week at Connection Point Studies.